vote must be at the top of Congress's agenda. At the local level, many of us have heard stories about how difficult voting can be, whether it's a grandmother who can't register to vote because she can't find her birth certificate, college students prevented from registering to vote in the place where they go to school, or even malfunctioning voting machines that lead to long lines and voters who need to get back to work, so they have to give up and leave the line. Certainly, we have seen that over and over again. 2016 was the first presidential election in half a century where the full Voting Rights Act was not in effect. Since the Supreme Court's 2013 Shelby County decision striking down a key section in the Voting Rights Act, we have seen a lot of action on the state and local level. And while some states and local communities have improved access to voting, others have restricted it, often by targeting poor people and minority communities. We've seen numerous voter suppression laws passed, a number of which have been struck down by courts for being discriminatory. Earlier this year, the Supreme Court refused to hear an appeal on North Carolina's strict voter ID law, which was struck down, as we know, last year by the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. In its decision, the Fourth Circuit said that the law would target African Americans with almost surgical precision. But we can't just count on the courts doing the right thing. That's why Senate Democrats continue to call for a proactive legislative agenda to increase the opportunity for people to exercise their right to vote in our country. Our members have introduced legislation on election security, expanding voter registration, creating more opportunities for voters to cast their ballots. Chief among our proposals is the Voting Rights Advancement Act, sponsored by my colleague Senator Leahy, co-sponsored by nearly the entire Senate Democratic Caucus. Meanwhile, the Trump administration continues to promote the unfounded narrative of widespread voter fraud with its so-called Election Integrity Commission and its attempts to acquire a vast amount of personal information on American voters. Protecting voting rights should be bipartisan. I think all of us feel that way. It should be a no-brainer. It should be bipartisan. And that's why I'm very disappointed that Republicans in Congress have refused to hold any hearings on updating the Voting Rights Act and on the state of voting rights in America. And that's why we're here doing our own hearing. Senate Democrats will continue to do all we can to protect the right to vote for tens of millions of Americans and to find ways to eliminate restrictions on voting. I look forward to hearing from our terrific expert witnesses today. I know it's going to be a very productive discussion. All of my colleagues care deeply about this, and our leaders in their states, and all of you are true leaders in the fight to protect and strengthen the right to vote in our democracy. We're honored to have you taking the time to be with us today. Now I'd like to turn to my colleague from Minnesota, Senator Amy Klobuchar, who's the ranking member on the Senate Rules Committee, to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Senator Stabenow, and I think we've seen many of you several times this week, and thank you for your advocacy. Unfortunately, the Rules Committee hasn't had any hearings this year, so I'm glad that you are willing to have this discussion about what is happening with voting. We have seen, as Senator Stabenow noted, and the court has said succinctly, efforts to discriminate with surgical precision. 3-hour lines in Arizona, 100 miles to the nearest polling station in Nevada and Utah, photo ID requirements in Wisconsin, where we now know it can really be hard to get an ID in the first place. This isn't just going on in one state. This is a systematic effort across our country. And what does the administration do? They make things worse by establishing the so-called Commission on Election Integrity. This is not about integrity when you look at what they're doing. And in fact, it can make things worse by trying to gather information that many Republican Secretary of States have spoken out against in one location that we try to avoid when we have decentralized voting systems. I don't think that was an accident either. They are just simply making people concerned about voting. And we've heard in some states like Colorado that people actually took away their own registrations because they didn't want to have their data shared. Solutions, well, same-day registration. I know that Minnesota had the highest voter turnout. I know that the Honorable Natalie Tennant knows this, but we had the highest voter turnout last year of any state and consistently are in the top 1 or 2. That's because we have same-day registration. I have a bill to do that nationally with Senator Tester and others. And then also automatic voter registration, a bill I'm introducing last week that would require automatic voting registration state by state for eligible voters when they turn 18. These are not radical proposals. These are proposals that we should all support, whether we're Democrats, Republicans, or Independents, because our democracy is founded on one simple principle, that citizens get to participate, and we should be making it easier to participate and not harder. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've also asked Senator Jeanne Shaheen to make some opening statements. There was a hearing in New Hampshire last week. Both Senator Shaheen and Senator Maggie Hassan, I know, were a part of this, and we'd like very much to get an update from Senator Shaheen.
Well, thank you, Senator Stabenow, and thank you for convening this hearing. Actually, we had hoped to be a part of that, but in fact, they refused to allow us to have our testimony read as part of the commission. You know, the fact is the Trump administration's Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity, that's sort of Orwellian, the Pence Commission is what I call it, held a hearing in New Hampshire last week, and it did exactly the opposite. It further misled Americans and Granite Staters about the integrity of our electoral process. And I think, as many here would agree, that President Trump's baseless assertions about illegal immigrants and illegal voting in the 2016 election really has zero evidence to support them. Chris Kobach, the vice chair of that commission, did a column in Breitbart where he made allegations about our election in New Hampshire in 2016, the election of Senator Hassan and of Hillary Clinton, who won the New Hampshire electoral vote, and said that we allowed out-of-staters to vote. He clearly did not understand our election laws, and he was corrected by both the Secretary of State of New Hampshire and Maine. What we have seen is that the real objective of this commission is to lay the groundwork for voter suppression laws, and we saw that at the hearing last week in New Hampshire. The people testifying before that panel recommended things like thumbprints on photo IDs, criminal background checks before people would be allowed to register to vote. And I think one of the important points to point out to people is that Americans lose trust in their elections when politicians question the validity of those elections without evidence. And, you know, we had a hearing earlier today in the Foreign Relations Committee, and John Huntsman, who has been nominated to be ambassador to Russia, it was on his nomination. And we talked about the Russian interference in our elections in 2016, and he said something that I think is really important, that speaks to what happens when elected officials undermine our process. He said, and I thought this was so important to repeat, "For me, as a former governor, you're tasked with the integrity of your election system. Sometimes You have nothing more important than the integrity of your election process at the localest of levels, and to work to undercut or subvert or sow seeds of doubt or distrust about that system is the highest level of injury that can be laid on a local election system. So I thought Governor Huntsman said that very well, and it points to the fact that we cannot overstate the dangers that lie in spreading this kind of misinformation. The Pence Commission and its motives are not to investigate vote fraud. They're to intimidate voters, particularly students, minority voters, low-income voters, to dissuade them from participating in our electoral process. So thank you to all the witnesses who are here today for helping us to shed light on what the real intent of this administration is.
Thank you very much, Senator Shaheen. I know that Senator Wyden was going to be with us. I think he will be at some point. He wants to speak to his bill by mail act as well, and we certainly look forward to that. But we're going to turn now to very, very important guests that are with us. Sherrilyn Ifill, the president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, through its litigation and advocacy, has worked tirelessly to expand democracy and eliminate racial disparities. Welcome. Vanita Gupta. Vanita Gupta is the president of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which promotes and protects civil and human rights of all people in the United States. Ms. Gupta was the head of the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. Reverend Dr. Wendell Anthony, my great friend from Detroit, who is president of the Detroit branch of the NAACP. Are we still the largest chapter? I believe we are, yes. And I know we have the largest annual dinner, of which you are all welcome to attend. Over, at any given time, 12 to 14,000 people sit-down dinner, and the food is always hot. I still have not figured this out as we do this, but it's a powerful dinner. And Reverend Anthony is a respected civil rights leader in Detroit, in southeastern Michigan, and in our country. And he has seen firsthand the effects of what voter enfranchisement and voter suppression can do to a community. Tomas Saenz. We are so pleased, Mr. Saenz, to have you with us as President and General Counsel of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Through your litigation and advocacy work, MALDEF has been working to secure access to the voting booths for all citizens. And last but not least, Natalie Tennant. Natalie is former West Virginia Secretary of State and Manager of State Advocacy on the Brennan Center's Voting Rights and Elections Project. During her tenure as Secretary of State, she emerged as a leader on election modernization. So as you can tell, we have a terrific panel, and we'll start with Ms. Ifill.
Thank you, Chairwoman Stabenow, for convening this timely and important hearing, and to all of the senators who are here today. There we go. Thank you, Chairwoman Stabenow, for convening this timely and important hearing, and for the invitation to appear and to share my views, and to all of the senators who thought it was important to be here for this discussion. In my brief statement, I'd like to provide context for our discussion today and to explain why the current moment demands urgent congressional action to restore the full protections of the Voting Rights Act, but also to address the issues that we heard in the introduction from Senator Stabenow, the threat to a core and central piece of our democracy, and that is the right to vote, the ability to participate in the political process. The organization I lead, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, has been on the front lines in the fight for equal voting rights since its founding in 1940. One of our earliest successes was Thurgood Marshall's case challenging the all-white Democratic primary in Texas in 1944, Smith versus Allwright. And since that time, we've continued until today working on this urgent issue that we regard as central to the full citizenship of African Americans. After the violent acts of domestic terror in Charlottesville, Americans have started a national conversation about white supremacy. I don't think I've heard the word white supremacy as much in my life as I've heard it over the last month. And I think that's a good thing, and that conversation is long overdue. It's been somewhat encouraging. Political leaders of both parties have roundly rebuked white supremacy as a repugnant force that must be eradicated from American life. Last week, Congress approved a measure condemning white supremacists and calling on the Justice Department to investigate and prosecute hate groups who foment racial violence. Those responses are appropriate and welcome, but they're incomplete. We cannot have a full conversation about white supremacy in this country without also talking about the right to vote. And we cannot fully defeat white supremacy unless Congress acts to ensure that state-sponsored discrimination is not a barrier between voters of color and the polls. The truth is that intimidation and disenfranchisement of black voters has always been central to American supremacy. For decades, states and local jurisdictions suppressed votes with poll taxes, literacy tests, and needlessly confusing registration requirements. Today, they use strict voter ID laws, voter roll purges, proof of citizenship requirements, and racial gerrymandering. It's the same discrimination in different forms. A federal court in Texas recognized as much when it found that the state's voter ID law constitutes an unconstitutional poll tax. And that decision is just one of many. Since 2014, there have been at least 10 federal court decisions finding that states or local governments intentionally discriminated against African Americans and other voters of color when enacting legislation. This is a watershed moment in this country. That means legislatures and county councils convening and passing laws for the purpose of disenfranchising American voters. I've submitted the full list for the record of those cases. It includes cases from Texas, Louisiana, Wisconsin, North Carolina, including the Fourth Circuit's decision that was referred to earlier. We add to this, of course, the president's so-called Election Integrity Commission that's already been discussed. It's the subject of 7 lawsuits. And we add to it also the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, who has pulled back on the prosecution of proven intentional discrimination in voting. We are witnessing a kind of perfect form of voter suppression in which, perhaps for the first time, the federal government, through this Election Integrity Commission and the Attorney General, are also openly hostile to voting rights and is actively supporting voter suppression. The federal courts are taking their time deciding these cases, and the states, of course, are doing what the Reconstruction Congress knew they would do when they used the language in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, no state shall, or states are prohibited from. The framers of those amendments not only put limits on state conduct that would undermine the full citizenship of African Americans, they included enforcement clauses in each of the Civil War amendments, entrusting you, Congress, with the authority to enforce the rights that were to give full citizenship to African Americans. In 1965, a bipartisan Congress responded with the Voting Rights Act, which for nearly 50 years was the most effective civil rights statute in our nation's history. But now we need so much more. We need the Voting Rights Act to be restored. We need the array of legislation that many of you have sponsored that will expand voting. We need your oversight of the Department of Justice. We need you to look closely at the Election Integrity Commission and the appropriations for that commission's work. And we need you to speak regularly, loudly, clearly about the importance of the right to vote for every American. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gupta. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Chairman Stabenow, and all of you for convening this very important event. I'm really honored to be here today. I am the president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. It's a coalition of more than 200 national organizations, and we were founded in 1950 and have coordinated all of the national lobbying efforts on almost every piece of major civil rights legislation since 1957, including the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Voting rights are today just under assault, plain and simple. I think there's no question. And you heard, obviously, everyone knows about the devastating Shelby County decision and about the North Carolina and Texas federal courts speaking very clearly about the intentional race discrimination of those laws, and about 10 voting rights decisions that federal courts have now said they found intentional racial discrimination post-Shelby in the way that states reacted in enacting restrictive voting laws. So I don't want to get into that. But I do want to focus on something that's personally very heartbreaking for me to witness, which is the Sessions Justice Department's retreat from the Justice Department's historic and I would say bipartisan commitment to aggressive voting rights enforcement. It has always been an aggressive area of bipartisan enforcement in the past. In February, the Justice Department reversed a long-standing litigating position that the Texas voter ID law was intentionally racially discriminatory. Thankfully, federal courts continue to uphold that finding, despite the Justice Department's change in position. In June, on the very same day that the Pence-Kobach Commission was announced, the Civil Rights Division sent an unprecedented letter. It was never before done to 44 states, asking for extensive information on how states maintain their roles in what appears to be a prelude to voting purge efforts. And in August, the Justice Department filed a brief with the Supreme Court in the Husted versus A. Philip Randolph Institute case, reversing its position, a very long-standing position, arguing that it should be easier for states to remove registered voters from their rolls. And then we have, as you all know, we've talked about President Trump's so-called Advisory Commission on Election Integrity, which was really set up to investigate the president's rather absurd allegations that millions have voted illegally in the 2016 election. We know that the real reason the commission was created was to restrict the right to vote. And the commission's membership tells you all that you need to know, from Chris Kobach and Hans von Spakovsky to the other commissioners who frankly have devoted their entire careers to voter suppression efforts and conspiracy theories about mass voter fraud. And in fact, just last week, Hans von Spakovsky was recently identified as the sender of an email to the Justice Department, originally before the formation of this commission, urging that no Democrats or, quote, mainstream Republicans be permitted to serve on the commission. This is now plain and simple for everyone to see. The commission's attempt to create a national database of sensitive voter information should really alarm any of us who value privacy, security, and the integrity of our elections, and that's why you saw so many Republican and Democratic secretaries of state speak out. Working hand in hand with other civil rights organizations, we've mounted a nationwide effort to discredit this commission, and we urge that Congress deny appropriations to the sham commission, and we appreciate the efforts that many of you are making to pursue that strategy. It also, though, anti-voting rights crusade cuts across his agenda. His judicial nominations also demonstrate the administration's commitment to thwarting full access to the franchise. Tomorrow, the Senate Judiciary Committee is holding a hearing for Thomas Farr of North Carolina, who has had a long history of defending voter suppression efforts, and we would urge the senators to oppose his confirmation. But we know it's not enough to play defense. There are a number of pieces of legislation that the Leadership Conference Coalition has been vocally in support of, from the Voter Empowerment Act to the Democracy Restoration Act to the Automatic Voter Registration Act, where we in the states, as you said, have seen a lot of momentum, bipartisan momentum. Somehow in Congress, we're only seeing Democratic sponsorship, and we hope that will change. Along with these measures, we need a fully funded 2020 census. It's among the most significant civil rights issues that we face today. Accurate census data is essential to ensuring fair and proportionate voting representation for all Americans, and we are working hard to ensure that there's a fair appropriations, especially to ensure historically undercounted populations are counted where there's such fear among immigrant communities in particular right now. And then we urge, finally, for Congress to exercise its oversight powers to closely monitor the voting rights work coming out of the Justice Department. And we hope that also you'll find ways to ensure timely responses to really important oversight letters. We know that voting rights has to transcend partisanship, and we are really there behind you to do everything that we can in the long-haul fight to ensure that everyone's right to vote is protected. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Reverend Anthony, welcome.
Senator. Thank you, Senator, and let me thank all of you for being here and for calling this hearing. I think one of the prime benefits of this hearing is the fact that you're holding it. One of the reasons that people are not voting is because they do not have hope. They do not believe that their votes are making any differences because of the fact of what we see happening nationally today. Years ago, the great freedom fighter and suffragette Sojourner Truth was speaking at a rally in upstate New York. While she was speaking, an elderly white gentleman in the rear end said to her, "Old woman, what you're saying to me means about as much to me as that of a flea buzzing around the rear end of an elephant." Sojourner Truth looked at the gentleman and said, "Old man, you might not like my buzzing, but I'm guaranteed to keep you scratching." It is important that we continue to keep the proverbial elephant scratching today. We're here because we must continue to keep the elephant scratching because of the foes of voting rights and people empowerment. They must itch from our persistent and determined efforts to eliminate barriers to voting booths. We must expose the illegitimate political schemes designed to frustrate and to suppress the people's will and their right to vote. It is important to remember and to reflect upon the fact that when we see what we see on our national level, one is not inspired by what we see. As a matter of fact, it has a very opposite significance. They do not inspire the people, they depress the people. In my own state of Michigan, just last year, the state legislature attempted to introduce a more strenuous voter ID law. The law would require state-approved photo identification. Any individual who did not have it would have been required to bring ID to their local clerk's office within 10 days of the election. Failure to do so would have resulted in the disqualification of the voter and thus would, in fact, nullify the vote. It's hard enough to get folks to stand in line to vote, so they're not going to come back 10 days after an election to prove that they did vote. Its implementation would have resulted in many citizens in the African-American community, students and seniors, not being eligible to vote based on finances and travel to secure identification that was acceptable to the state. That bill was beat back by the pressure of the people, and it was pulled off the table. There is still a hunger, of a racist hunger, to bring it back and to bring other bills like that to the table. This so-called 13-member Independent Citizens Commission, the so-called Election Protection or Integrity Commission that was instituted by the president, to us is no more than one of the biggest scams that we have seen in U.S. political history. The fact that this committee is composed of all those persons, quite frankly, for the most part, Chris Kobach, Hans von Spakowski, Ken Blackwell, J. Christian Adams, folk like Bill Gardner from New Hampshire, who in New Hampshire, according and Senator Shaheen knows, recently just had this law that basically is going to suppress some of the young people, students, and disadvantaged by exercising their right to vote as a result of get to the polls. It is important that as the founder of Take Your Souls to the Polls from Michigan, that we consistently have and we update and do engage in the Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2017, designed to repair, restore, and strengthen the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We the House and Senate to endorse and support H.R. 297-8 and S. 1419. Among those other things we believe that is important, update and implement the preclearance formula to cover states with a historical pattern of practicing discrimination, guarantee that no last-minute voting changes will adversely affect voters, protect voters from the voting changes that most likely to impact people of color and language minorities, enhance the ability to apply a pre-clearance review when needed, support legislation in local communities that will allow the redrawing of district lines for communities to ensure the political representation and eliminate gerrymandering. We have an initiative right now in Michigan that is structured to put a bill on the ballot that would allow us to redraw the district lines, not by the politicians, by the local community folk. Increase same-day registration and voting. The use of social media must become a major priority. Text messaging, texting your vote. Facebook, take a look at your vote. Snapchat, snap your fingers and vote. Twitter, your vote is but a tweet away. Instagram, you can instantly change your own future. Increase funds for updating equipment and training for states and local communities. There was a recent audit in the city of Detroit where Detroit was accused of having some voter fraud. The audit found that there was no fraud, that there was outdated machines, that there was some training that needed to occur. We suggest that we have a national holiday for national elections, providing more time for voter participation. Increased time allowed to participate in early and absentee voting. There must be a renewed effort implemented within our educational system to teach the benefits and responsibilities of participation in the American democratic process. The structure of our government and responsibility to participate in the electoral process should be taught beginning in elementary through the high school. The emphasis must not be placed on political party or ideology, but on responsibility and civic duty. We're reminded of the words of Alexis de Tocqueville, who said generations ago, the greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather in her ability to repair her faults. It's time to repair our faults. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reverend Anthony, for those comments. Mr. Sines, good to have you with us.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, all of you, for conducting this critically important hearing at this time. MALDEF's mission is to promote the civil rights of all Latinos living in the United States. We will celebrate our 50th anniversary next year in 2018. From almost the very beginning, of our organization's existence, focusing on the vote and securing access to the ballot and fair election systems have been top priorities for MALDEF. We join our colleagues in condemning the Election Integrity Commission, which was born out of Donald Trump's scurrilous mythology about illegal voting, fraudulent voting in the 2016 election, that, like many of these allegations, focused on the Latino community. Because of the actual and projected growth of the Latino community, too often our community is the target of attempts to suppress votes, either through restricting access to the ballot or registration, or through election systems that deprive the community of a meaningful vote. So we join in condemning the commission and urge you to look at its funding, and urge you to look at its bias, and urge you to ensure that it cannot engage in the intimidation that it seems designed to create. I've in the past characterized this commission as an Area 51 commission because voter fraud is about as common as documented UFO sightings in this country. But today I'd like to focus on the Latino community's experience after Shelby County, and in particular with the lack of pre-clearance coverage of the entire state of Texas, the entire state of Arizona, and portions of California. This has affected the work of MALDEF in palpable ways. We have had to redouble our efforts to challenge election systems and ballot access provisions that restrict the rights of Latinos. In some cases, we have had to leave the pursuit of litigation against Texas voter ID, for example, to our very capable colleagues, but our own lack of participation, because we had to direct our efforts elsewhere, has affected the overall goal of preserving voting rights. I will give you one example of what we have faced. The city of Pasadena, Texas, very shortly after the Shelby County decision was announced, decided through its mayor to change its structure of government from a city council consisting of 8 members elected from districts to a structure of 6 members elected from districts and 2 elected at large. It undertook that change pretty clearly to prevent the growing Latino community, which was on the cusp of electing a majority of the districted council members, from controlling the city council. We had to challenge that change successfully through a very arduous and expensive pretrial preparation, including discovery and experts and all the rest, and a lengthy trial. In the end, the judge concluded that there was not only a dilutive, unlawful effect on the Latino vote, but that the change was intended to have that dilutive effect on the Latino community in Pasadena, Texas. It resulted in what we believe to be the first contested bail-in order subjecting a jurisdiction to preclearance in the future. But my point is, it took much work and cost to achieve that end for one small city in Texas. Prior to Shelby County, MALDEF relied heavily on the deterrent effect of preclearance, not just in covered jurisdictions, but in uncovered jurisdictions as well, which paid attention to what electoral changes were blocked by the Department of Justice or the D.C. Federal Court, and paid attention to the changes that were required through the preclearance review before attempting similar changes in their own jurisdictions. We no longer have that deterrent effect. And it affects not only MALDEF, but I want to identify one of the frequently uncited beneficiaries of the preclearance process, and that is the taxpayers of the defendant jurisdictions. Preclearance saved those defendant jurisdictions literally billions of dollars over the course of the time that preclearance was in effect. Why? Because without preclearance, they would have been subject to litigation, and in the end, when they lose, they would be subject not only to paying their own lawyers and experts, but the other sides as well. So I urge you and to urge your colleagues to see the preclearance provisions not simply as they've been accurately described, the most effective civil rights provision ever written into federal law, but also as one of the first and most effective alternative dispute resolution systems ever written into federal law. It's one of the unexplained ironies of policymaking today that some of those who embrace ADR in the context of consumers and employment are not supporting ADR when it comes to the vote. In fact, like ADR, preclearance saved billions of dollars for the jurisdictions that would otherwise be the targets of litigation and would ultimately have to pay not only their own costs, but the other sides as well. We need this ADR mechanism reintroduced, and we urge you and your colleagues to support a new formula to apply preclearance across the board.
Thank you very much, and welcome, Natalie Tennant. Madam Secretary. We're
Thank you
glad
so
to have
much,
you with
Senator.
us.
I appreciate being here, and I appreciate all of you for the invitation and having this hearing in this meeting as well. As you know, I'm the former Secretary of State of West Virginia, where I took very seriously my job of expanding voting rights for the citizens of West Virginia. And I did it with a forward-thinking approach. And now I have that opportunity to continue working on those initiatives at the Brennan Center for Justice out of NYU School of Law. And I'm proud to be joined today by my colleague, Nicole Austin Hillary, with whom many of you work. And so as we talk about some of these initiatives and the concerns, obviously, that we have, what can be done, I want to share some examples with you, just a piece of what we did in West Virginia. West Virginia had early voting back in 2002. In 2009, we implemented satellite voting or community voting, and it was during the early voting period, and it expanded voting opportunities, and many people now refer to them across the country as vote centers. Well, what they do is they allow county election officials to offer additional early voting locations away from the primary courthouse locations. And so for rural counties where it's a 45-minute to an hour drive to your county seat, this obviously offers much-needed accessibility and convenience. And a voter from any precinct can go into the center, be given the appropriate ballot, and then votes it. So early voting reduces the stress on the voting system on Election Day. It alleviates administrative burdens and reduces voter frustration. In West Virginia, we modernized the election process through online voter registration that upgraded the outdated paper-based systems and increased convenience because it took voter registration to where people are, on their phones, on their digital and their handheld devices, as the Reverend was talking about. Automatic voter registration is a common sense, bipartisan approach that we passed in West Virginia in 2016. Now, with AVR, eligible citizens who interact with government agencies are registered to vote unless they choose to decline. And the agencies then transfer the voter registration information electronically to election officials. So what this does, it makes for a seamless process that's more convenient, less error-prone for both voters and for government officials. And it's an easy, simple, yet effective technology solutions that is possible to protect voting rights by making sure that we're eliminating errors in registration. This innovative policy that the Brennan Center developed more than a decade ago boosts voter registration. It cleans the rolls, it makes it easier to vote, and reduces the potential for voter fraud, all the while saving money. Why is it so important to get people registered to vote? Pretty simple question, right? Well, not only does it get them to the polls, but this is the true beginning of voter engagement. Because think about it, when someone is registered to vote, they're a registered voter, they begin to receive election mailings, whether they are voter guidelines or voter guides, sample ballots from their state or local election officials, or information from candidates and organizations themselves. They are now a more informed electorate. With registered voters, resources are shifted from voter registration drives to get out the vote efforts that encourage voters to participate. And that means that there's more interaction also. An example of that can be going door to door and knocking on doors and engaging voters where they live on their front porch. It allows that. And from an administrative standpoint, election officials have a steadier stream of people who are registering rather than that huge crush at the end, at the deadline of voter registration. And that crush can cause mistakes, overworked employees, the need for temp workers, and frustrated voters. So, Madam Chairman, these are examples. There are ways to defend and expand the rights of eligible Americans. And we at the Brennan Center, as always, are ready to work and assist in any way that we can do. So I'm looking forward to this discussion that we're having, and I'll be willing to take questions also. Thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you very much to all of you. And we do want to have an opportunity to ask questions. I'm first, though, going to just turn for a moment to Senator Wyden. Senator Wyden, I spoke about your Vote by Mail Act before you were here, but you've been such a leader on this, we want to give you a moment to speak about that.
Well, Madam Chair, thank you. And just out of deference to my colleagues who've been waiting so long, I'm going to keep this real brief, make a quick comment, and then open up a couple of matters for the record. I do want, as the chair has indicated, to give everybody in America the chance to vote by mail. We've had this now for a fair number of years in our state. This empowers voters. We haven't had problems with fraud. It's efficient. And the reality is much of the country is already going to this. We don't have excuse voting and all this kind of thing in a lot of places. So what we say in this legislation, I think there are 19 senators who are now co-sponsors of the bill, is for every federal election, eligible voters would receive a ballot in the mail. The federal government covers the costs of mailing ballots to registered voters through the Postal Service. States can keep their polling places if they wish, but states that choose to do an entirely vote-by-mail system, in my view, are going to see their costs drop significantly. And states that keep their polling centers would produce a paper ballot so that voters, again, have a paper trail for what they're doing. And I think because I want to be sensitive to my colleagues who've been waiting so long, I'd just like to ask for two of you to answer questions for the record so I don't interrupt my colleagues. Ms. Tennant, you've been doing really good work on mail and voter registration. It would be helpful to have in writing, we'll get it to you, your views on how voting by mail and automatic voter registration helps to reverse the kind of voter suppression efforts that we have seen in the past. So we'll give that to you in writing. You're doing very good work, and we appreciate it. Same with respect to you, Ms. Gupta. I'm on the Intelligence Committee, one of the other hats that I wear, and the cybersecurity people we talk with all recommend, in connection with this general topic of improving ways to have people vote by mail, to have risk-limiting audits of elections. My understanding is that in the past you have been interested in routine audits to promote public confidence and trust in our elections. And in the interest of time, if both of you could just take those questions, get it to Chair Stabenow in writing. We really appreciate your good work, and we'll get you the questions in writing, because I've seen you wondering if you remembered everything I said. We'll get them to you in writing. We'd appreciate your answer. And to colleagues who've been gracious to let me just kind of barge in when you've been waiting, my thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Thank you very much for your great work in this area. Let me first open it up and ask Reverend Anthony, as in the community, on the ground, what changes have you seen in terms of access to voting, and what's the tangible, specific things that we need to be doing to make sure more people have the access to vote? We've talked about online voting and vote by mail and other things, but thinking of the very basic things about equipment and machines and the kinds of things, what have you seen?
Thanks, Senator. Some of the fundamental things are equipment update. There needs to be an increase in funds to provide current equipment in greater numbers, expanded relative to people being able to access their polls in their local communities. The issue of funding for training, more funds need to be applied for training relative to poll workers and updating that kind of thing. And the other thing is this, Senator, the issue of gerrymandering districts is very, very potent. That's real. We have found that even in the state of Michigan, certain people are outvoting the other folks, but because of the way the district lines have been drawn, the votes are diluted. Michigan is one of the worst states in terms of the evidence of gerrymandering that we've seen. North Carolina is up there and a whole bunch of others, but Michigan can wave its own flag. We've been doing some work with folk from the Brennan Center in terms of the ballot proposal that I mentioned, but I think even if we are able to increase the vote, which we are working on, the way the lines are drawn, it makes it difficult to win elections because they have been rack-packed and stacked against local communities. So I think, Senator, the training, the equipment, the time period for early voting, same day voter registration and voter participation, those are some tangible things I think we can do and need to do, not only in Detroit and Michigan, but all across the country.
The other thing I wonder if we might speak about is empowering our young people. Detroit NAACP does a tremendous job in reaching out to young people and so on. When we look at what we need to be doing to engage and empower young people to register and to vote, what would you suggest?
Well, I think social media has got to be employed much more so than it is. And I tried to speak to that, being, respectful of my colleagues as a senator was, but the older, more mature community goes to Facebook. The younger, more progressive, energetic community goes to Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram. That's where they're at. And so that's how we're going to capture many of them. That's why I mentioned things like text messaging, texting your vote, Facebook, take a look at your vote, Snapchat. These are programs. Snap your fingers and vote. Twitter, your vote is but a tweet away. Instagram, you can instantly change your own future. I think that those are the social media approach has to be employed. I'm the originator of Take Your Souls to the Polls. And that was is a program that goes door to door knocking, door knockers, on the porch conversations. We use social media, but now we're increasing that because the way you get to them is to go where they're at. They're not coming to you. You got to go to them. And the way you go to them is where they live. They live on the cell phone. They live on this medium. So I think that if the Democratic voting committee and your commission is going to make any significant impact, it has to be in the area of social media, and it has to be in the area of what does this mean for me? How does this improve and affect my life personally? And I think that's the message we need to drive.
Thank you very much. Ms. Gupta, I'm turning back to the subject of the so-called Election Integrity Commission. Could you speak a little more about the biggest concerns about the extensive amount of information, the kinds of information that is being asked for in terms of voter records and people's individual information, and why that's concerning?
Sure. Originally when the initial inquiries went out, they were asking for such wide data, including Social Security numbers and data that is incredibly violative of people's privacy. It's why you saw in Colorado, for instance, thousands of people deregistering. We don't know the full number across the country of people who have already deregistered out of concern that their data is going to be kept in a centralized warehouse in the White House now on a computer. And there is a lot of concern about how this data is getting collected and how it will be kept. I think that one of the things that we really need to focus on is, while some of this data is publicly available, and states absolutely have the right to share that data, the concern really is with what happens with that data once it's been collected. Chris Kobach has long had a program called Crosscheck, where he, under the name of kind of stopping mass voter purge, is trying to cross-compare to ensure that there aren't double voters or people voting twice in the same election and the like. And while that's obviously a noble cause, that database has extremely high error rate. In fact, so much so that states like Oregon and Florida took themselves out of that database because of the error rate. And the danger is that whatever database gets collected, that it will then be used as grounds to purge voters unlawfully off of the rolls without sufficient checks and guardrails around that. The initial letter also went out without any guardrails about how that data could be used, where it could be stored, who would have access to it. And in an age where we're so deeply concerned about hacking into our election, having the centralized database on a White House computer certainly does not assuage those concerns. It's why you saw people like General Mukasey write an op-ed in the Washington Post about the real national security dangers of this. So I think there's a lot of concerns right now about how this data is going to be collected and used.
Thank you very much. Returning to Senator Klobuchar, I know there's.
Some of our other colleagues are welcome to go.
Thank you very much. And Senator Hassan is next.
Well, thank you, Senator Stabenow, and thank you all for being here and for the work that you do. Voting is our most essential and fundamental right, and we have to do everything we can to protect that right. And I am as discouraged as the next person about what we have seen from this administration and from the Pence Commission, but I am really proud to be standing with all of you in this fight and with my colleagues in the Senate and throughout the country. I wanted to turn back for a moment to the events in New Hampshire last week when the Pence Commission came to my state. We heard some very troubling testimony at that commission meeting, including a proposal to consider using background check system we use for gun purchases as a way of screening voters. But even more disturbing were suggestions that when burdens like poll taxes and literacy tests were in place, voter turnout was far higher than it is now. To be clear, poll taxes and literacy tests were among the tools used in the Jim Crow era to prevent minorities from voting. And they worked because they kept turnout very low among black voters in the South. Fortunately, we have since outlawed these restrictions, and black turnout in the South increased by nearly 50% between 1964 and 2012. To Ms. Ifill and Ms. Gupta, you spoke about poll taxes and literacy tests in your testimony. Could you expand a bit on how the very misguided version of history that we heard at the Pence Commission in New Hampshire last week distorts the reality of how voter suppression operates and about how new voter suppression tools are also aimed at reducing turnout among specific populations, such as minorities and young people?
Thank you, Senator. One of the most disturbing things about the Pence-Kobach Commission is its extraordinary cynicism, which was fully on display in New Hampshire last week. The idea that poll taxes and literacy tests somehow improved or increased voter participation turns history on its head. Yeah. Both poll taxes and literacy tests were the voter suppression tools of the 1950s and 60s, and they were designed to ensure that African Americans could not register to vote and participate in the political process. And as you point out, they were very effective in doing so. The elimination of these tests and recognition of these tests as voter suppression barriers were really centered around a very important reality, and that is that voting is the expression of citizenship in this country. Yeah. And that citizenship does not require one to have money to be able to pay to vote. Citizenship does not require one to be literate or even literate to a certain level. Citizenship comes with the fact that you are either born or naturalized in this country. And to attach any conditions onto citizenship for the purpose of exercising the right to vote violates that fundamental truth. And what we see today, since the Shelby decision, with the kind of voter ID laws, I mean, ironically, the idea of doing the background check is so fascinating that is used for guns is really extraordinary. It actually marries together two things that are deeply pernicious. It marries together the broken criminal justice system, which disproportionately affects African Americans and Latinos, to the effort of voter suppression, attempting essentially to use the over-criminalization that is visited on African Americans and in African American communities as yet another means to disenfranchise voters. And it's also true that this has the effect of doing precisely what we heard about earlier, which is there is something happening with this commission that I think requires greater urgency, and it's why this hearing is so important. Every day this commission continues, foments a sense of cynicism and insecurity within the public who you want to come out and vote. Right. Every day that the government is allowed to collect this information, hold this information on a server in the White House, use private emails to share this information, make the kind of ahistorical claims that you described openly and notoriously, and continue its work. We just get up and we go on the next day. The message is being sent to African Americans, many of whom lived through the civil rights movement, who lived through this era in which we had to hold up a mirror to America to see itself. and it makes them cynical about whether they should continue to participate in the political process. And so there is a sense of urgency, I would just say, around the dismantling of this phony commission. And I hope in this discussion we'll talk about what can be done actually to do that.
And Ms. Gupta, just briefly, if you can.
Yeah, I would just add that the reality is that even if this commission isn't disbanded, they are going to issue a report of some sort that is going to hyperinflate and mislead, as they did last week, that Chris Kobach did with evidence out of New Hampshire, claiming that the 2016 election as conducted in New Hampshire contained a lot of undetected voter fraud. And I just think it's really important to talk about how insulting last week's testimony was on this poll tax, kind of historical distortion, actually, of history in the face of the fact that Chris Kobach has had a long-standing anti-immigrant, anti-Latino agenda, crafter of SB 1070 in Arizona, and that he walked in and has been known to want to amend the National Voter Registration Act, which is the motor voter bill, to lower the burden of proof for states to purge voters. And there's serious litigation now in Ohio, which is now the subject of a Supreme Court case, and in Georgia on this very topic. And the U.S. says that minorities are represented in 85 of the 100 most common last names. A lot of those folks are going to have Latino last names and are going to be targeted as a result of his efforts, and something that we need to be keeping a very careful eye on.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And we're going back and forth in a vote, so I'm going to get Senator Coons in here. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar, and thank you to you and Senator Stabenow for convening this. And thank you to each of our 5 witnesses today for your willingness to come and continue to share with us from your experience and your insight. I am deeply frustrated by the Judiciary Committee's failure to hold a hearing, but I'm grateful for this chance to talk with you about voting rights and about the situation of voting rights and voter suppression in the United States today. I think it is important to the future of our democracy at the same time that we're trying to get to the bottom of what happened with interference from a foreign power. We also need to be clear-eyed about ongoing actions domestically to try and use alleged concerns about voter integrity to, in fact, suppress voter participation, voter registration, voter activity. And we are in the late stage of a vote, so I'll try and be focused. Ms. Ifill, if you could, during this administration, we've already seen that the Civil Rights Division backed down from enforcing the Voting Rights Act in Veazey versus Abbott after 6 years of litigating the case. The Justice Department dropped its claim that Texas's voter ID law was passed with intent to discriminate against racial minorities. And then less than 2 months later, a federal judge found the law was passed with such intent. Why do you think the Civil Rights Division would have abandoned a meritorious claim of intentional race discrimination?
Well, the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, has long been in opposition to the aggressive and vigorous prosecution of the Voting Rights Act. And so it was no surprise to us, we were co-counsel with the Attorney General on that case, that there would be less enthusiasm about continuing to prosecute the case. But I think the decision to abandon the intentional discrimination claim was actually a very particular one. The intentional discrimination claim carries with it the possibility of a very particular remedy under the Voting Rights Act. And that remedy is bail-in, which we heard Mr. Saenz talk about earlier in the context of the city of Pasadena. That is the possibility of returning preclearance to a jurisdiction that has been found to engage in intentional discrimination. The state of Texas probably has the worst record of any state in the United States in terms of judicial decisions finding intentional discrimination in congressional redistricting and in other areas. And so it faces and faced and continues to face the very real possibility of a bail-in. And in my view, the Attorney General hoped to undermine that important remedy that would have allowed the residents of Texas to be protected against the legislature's intentionally discriminatory acts.
Ms. Gupta, you previously led the Civil Rights Division within the Department of Justice. When, in your view, would it be appropriate for the division to withdraw a claim or change its position in a similar case? And as Ms. Ifill suggests, is there any further reason to believe that what happened here was an attempt to avoid liability under what remains of the Voting Rights Act and the bail-in provision?
Well, I would just have to say that I agree with Ms. Ifill's analysis on that. It was really extraordinary for the Justice Department to reverse that position after career prosecutors in the Civil Rights Division had for 6 years prosecuted very aggressively a claim with private plaintiffs that Texas had engaged in intentional racial discrimination in enacting its voter ID law, and in fact had prevailed through numerous federal court decisions before the new Justice Department had withdrew that claim. It was an unprecedented action that I think much was an effort to avoid bail-in, and it just so turned out that the federal courts that then continue to consider the decision disagreed with this Justice Department and vindicated the career lawyers. It was also notable that none of the career lawyers who had actually toiled away for years on that case through trials and hearings signed the substantive papers that withdrew that claim.
Let me just ask a closing question, if I might, because I know we've got other senators eager to ask. Ms. Gupta, Mr. Sands, if you might, the Fourth Circuit also held North Carolina's post-Shelby voter ID case targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision. That's a quote. And those changes were passed by the state legislature with racially discriminatory intent. How can we help Americans appreciate that what may seem like technical or minor changes to voting laws are in fact attempts to discriminate against fellow Americans and bar them from the most foundational right in a democracy, which is the right to vote?
I think it's a good question. I think there is a tremendous amount of misunderstanding of how judges reach conclusions of intentional discrimination in both the North Carolina case and the Texas voter ID case, but I would add the Texas redistricting case as well. We now have a substantial number of judges at both the appellate level and the district court level who have reached conclusions that these attempts to suppress the vote are motivated by intentional discrimination. And no matter how much the Sessions Justice Department may seek to prevent those findings, they are real. They are findings by judges who have been appointed by presidents of both parties, and they're significant because of the size of these states. Texas is the second most populous state in the country. I think we can understand why Jeff Sessions would want to prevent that state in particular from being subject to a bail-in order, subjecting it to preclearance yet again. But I think we need to make sure the public understands how judges and how many judges have reached these careful conclusions after presentation through trial of substantial evidence on both sides.
Well, I just want to thank the whole panel, and I'll thank Senator Stabenow again for your leadership in convening this important hearing. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today.
Thank you, Senator Coons, very much. And apologize, there is a vote going on, so we're all going back and forth trying to do our best to be two places at once. So, Senator Warren.
Thank you very much, Senator Stabenow, and thank you again for convening this hearing. Thank you all for being here. The right to vote is under attack in this country, and since the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, voter suppression efforts have sharply accelerated. These new barriers are designed to shut out African Americans, Latinos, the elderly, students, and any other targeted groups, just to get them out of the democratic process. That is alarming enough, but now instead of protecting voters from voter suppression, the President of the United States is using the power of his office to advance voter suppression. Donald Trump lost the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes. He is president only because of the rules of the Electoral College, and he's pretty sensitive about that. And he has struck back with the claim that he lost the popular vote only because millions of people voted illegally. Now, Ms. Tennant, you served as the Secretary of State of West Virginia, administering elections. You currently lead state advocacy work for the Brennan Center, which examines these issues. Is there any evidence to back up the president's claim that millions of people voted illegally?
No.
Okay.
And I don't mean to be flippant about that, but
that's an answer.
When those claims came about, the Brennan Center was on almost immediately and issued a report called Non-Citizen Voting, the Missing Millions, where they analyzed information from the local election administrators. They went down into those who were administering the elections and were able to debunk the claims.
Okay, so you've looked at the data. Let me ask you a different question. According to our best available data on this, how prevalent is the phenomenon of individuals engaging in voting fraud?
it is rare. And when you look at a consensus of reports, investigations, not just from the Brennan Center, but other organizations and other advocates as well, you see that that rate of illegal voting is extremely rare.
So let me ask you, what is more probable? Someone engaging in voter fraud or someone getting struck by lightning?
This is a fact that the Brennan Center put out. So you must follow us on Twitter like the Reverend does.
You bet.
Being struck by lightning.
Being struck by lightning. Okay, I just want to be clear on this. So there are no facts to back up the president's claim. So the president decided to establish a commission to study voter fraud, a commission that seems entirely focused on promoting and justifying state-level voter suppression. So I just want to ask a little bit about those state-level efforts. Ms. Ifill, since 2010, how many states have passed laws to make it harder for citizens to vote?
20.
20. And have any states advanced voting laws that are so aggressively illegal and discriminatory that they have been invalidated by federal courts?
Oh, many, and just, since 2014, 10 of those decisions have been ones in which federal courts, including some of the most conservative federal courts in this country, have found that states or local jurisdictions intentionally enacted laws for the purpose of discriminating against African American and Latino voters.
So they found actual intent.
Intentional discrimination.
Intentional discrimination. Ms. Gupta, the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice is supposed to police unconstitutional efforts to suppress the vote. Has the Trump administration's Civil Rights Division demonstrated that it takes the problem of voter suppression seriously?
It has taken unprecedented action to reverse longstanding positions that career lawyers were litigating to establish just how voter suppression laws were working and that they were racially discriminatory. So, in fact, in a number of cases, including obviously the Texas ID case, which I've discussed, but also in the Husted case, have actually reversed positions that were aimed at really proving, according to a deep factual record, to establish voter suppression, the existence of voter suppression in the enactment of those laws. So, in fact, it would be the opposite.
So the Department of Justice has moved in exactly the opposite direction on voter suppression. Instead of protecting voters, they're helping the states in terms of suppressing the vote.
That appears to be the case, and there's a lot of concern now about the June letter that they sent out on trying to get information from states about national voter registration, voter purging efforts, and so we are anticipating more along those lines as well.
Okay. More and more Americans are worried about widespread voter fraud, and I don't blame them. The idea of widespread, coordinated effort to steal elections is really scary, and it is totally made up. But when the President of the United States uses his bullhorn to advance this theory, then a lot of people start to pay attention to it. And I'll be blunt, I don't expect the president to change. I don't expect Jeff Sessions, who has made a career out of undermining civil rights protections, to change. But they are not the only public officials in this country. 11 years ago, the Senate passed the Voting Rights Act by a vote of 98-0. And it is time for public officials at every level of government to start leading again on this issue. If we care about bringing this country together, then all Americans must have an equal vote in our democracy. And that means we could pass a new Voting Rights Advancement Act and other bills to protect the right to vote. We could conduct oversight over the Department of Justice, specifically the Civil Rights Division, and make sure they're enforcing our voting laws. We should be doing everything we can to avoid giving legitimacy to the president's sham election integrity commission. So we've got work to do on our side, too, to make sure that America understands the problem in this country is voter suppression. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Warren. And I was thinking that based on your exchange with Ms. Tennant, that maybe we need a commission on the impact of being struck by lightning.
You'll have more people.
That's right. That's right. I'd like to turn now to Senator Duckworth, who is the author of Pre-Registration of Voters Everywhere. Did I get that right? Pre-Registration of Voters Everywhere Act. So thank you for your leadership.
Thank you, Chairwoman Stabenow, and thank you to all of the witnesses for being here. It's good to see some of you again. It's a real pleasure to be here to discuss one of the founding tenets of our democracy, the right to vote. The strength of this democracy truly depends on the participation of the American people. Like my colleagues, I think that it's incredibly disturbing at the very least and dangerous for the Trump administration to continue to take measures to weaken voting rights. And it's really unfortunate that instead of focusing on actual serious threats to our democracy that are posed by foreign attacks on our election infrastructure, the president is actually trying to manufacture false evidence of massive voter fraud to justify his attempts at voter suppression. And while we must continue to fight efforts to suppress the vote and fight the horrible Shelby County decision, we can't solely remain on defense. And I think that what we need to do is also focus on expanding and increasing opportunities to voter participation. So I'm proud that my home state of Illinois just became the 10th state, along with the District of Columbia, to approve automatic voter registration. Yay. It's why I support legislation to expand Illinois' reforms nationwide, and it's also why I introduced the Pre-Registration of Voters Every Act, which is an act that will help young voters become more civically engaged. If we allow voters to become pre-registered to vote at the age of 16, we have a real chance to improve voter participation, to improve the accuracy of voting rolls, and to strengthen voting rights for Americans across the country. Ms. Tennant, welcome again. It's good to see you.
Thank you.
You discussed your home state's modernization of the election process, and currently at least 20 different states, including Illinois and West Virginia, allow people to pre-register to vote prior to the age of 18. Could you please discuss how engaging young people prior to the age of 18 can influence voter engagement?
Yes, it is very important. As I talked about in my opening statement, when you have registered voters, you have that participation level ready to be enacted. And it's almost as if it's like, come on in, you're part of the team now. And I think it's especially important for teenagers, for young voters to say, do I belong here? Am I allowed to be here? And I think that with pre-registration, you have that. And for a couple of reasons, they feel, yes, they're a part of it. And maybe even to use a term the Reverend might use or the teenagers might use, if they experience FOMO, this will certainly help them, which is FOMO. Everyone knows it's the fear of missing out. We don't want people to miss out on elections. If you get registered at the age of 16, we're going to where they are, right? Where are they? The DMV, because they want to get that driver's license. So if they get registered here, they'll automatically be registered when they turn 18. It'll be more convenient and a whole lot easier for them. And so that's why it's important. What we even do in West Virginia, you can register at the age of 17 and vote in the primary election at age 17 if you are going to be 18 on or before the general election. So those are ways to encourage young people to get involved.
Thank you. Ms. Ifill, welcome. You addressed the unfortunate historical context and its impact on voter suppression within the Black community specifically. According to the Pew Research Center, nearly 35% of Black eligible voters are young people. Do you think that engaging young people during their high school years would affect overall voter turnout, not just in African American communities, but in Black and Brown communities as well?
I absolutely think so, and this is why I think it's so important to find these opportunities to affirmatively register people to vote or bring people into the electorate. But I do think that it goes hand in hand with the protection of voters once they are registered, because what you don't want is a bait and switch. What will make young people even more cynical is to register them to vote and then have them be subjected to the kind of voter suppression tactics that we're seeing around the country, which are not just voter ID laws. It's moving polling places and redistricting in ways that essentially disenfranchise them. And so I think the two pieces have to be knit together. There has to be an aggressive effort to engage young people early in high school, to give them opportunities to engage civically. I'm of the belief that they're, the same way that people go to the post office, young men for selective service when they turn 18, all young people should go to the post office and register to vote when they turn 18. I think any means of automatically registering young people is critically important. But I also think it goes hand in hand with ensuring that once they are registered, we're guaranteeing them that their right to vote is protected, that they're able to participate in the political process, that their vote is able to count, and that they're not subject to the kind of tactics that we've seen in jurisdictions throughout the country that try to ensure that registered voters don't have power.
Mm-hmm. I think what you speak to is incredibly powerful. We had an issue in Chicago with our Chinatown area. Not an attempt at voter disenfranchisement, but really a leftover of a legacy of hundreds of years in the city where Chinatown was actually divided at the state level between multiple representation, so that there was, these 2 blocks of Chinatown was in this district, this 2 block was over here, these 2 blocks are over there, and they never were able to elect a member from the community to represent them. That's working to be fixed. We have some of the first Asian Americans elected at automatic races, but it's wrong that it took until I was elected to have the first Asian American elected to office when we have the only Chinatown in the United States that's still growing. So it's a different community than the traditional black and brown communities, but it is certainly one that is a real issue, and we need to make sure that in addition to the early registration, people can actually go vote and make a difference in what they're in the vote that they're casting.
A community also protected by the Voting Rights Act and was also protected by preclearance, and that's part of why we need access and then also the tools to vigorously protect.
Right, exactly. Ms. Sanes, am I saying that correctly? Mr. Sun, I apologize. You laid out the challenges for Latinos voting today. As you noted, Latinos are one of the fastest growing demographics of eligible voters. And I know that this particular population is well known as being particularly young. Nearly half of U.S.-born Latinos are younger than 18. Can you speak to the benefits of programming which involves them early on in the democratic process, such as pre-registration, and also perhaps anything that ties pre-registration to increased civic engagement?
I think it would have a tremendously positive effect because of the youth of the community, because of the connection to schooling when you reach them when they're still in high school, and are able to pre-register them when it's coupled with good civics education. I think it could have a particular impact in the Latino community because so many of our U.S. citizen youth may be the children of immigrants who are not yet naturalized, not yet able to vote. They therefore may not see in their families an example of voter participation. So having that provided to them through high school, through the DMV, through the kinds of things that youth engage in collectively, could be very positive in encouraging future participation in elections.
Thank you. And also, is there any, I don't know if there's data on this, but, I grew up, I was born in America and I was born overseas, and I didn't speak English till I was 8 years old, and I spent a lot of my youth translating for my mother. She became a citizen in her 50s, and just the role that young people in communities where there is a large immigrant population, whether it's the Asian American community or the Latino community, or even, African community where sometimes it's a young person who actually, if they're engaged, if they're registered to vote, are the ones who are going to encourage their parents who might not have gone to the polls otherwise.
There are millions of eligible but not yet naturalized citizens in the not yet naturalized citizens in the Latino community, and you're exactly right. If the children become engaged as native-born U.S. citizens in the electoral process, that may become an encouragement for their parents to take the step to naturalize so that they themselves can register to vote and participate.
Mm-hmm. And even if they are already citizens, the parents, sometimes
yes.
When you're that first-generation immigrant, you're worried about working and, you just don't have the time, and it's not something that you even participate in because it's not been a tradition, and sometimes it takes the children to.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right, and it is a continuum. I totally agree with Ms. Ifill. You have to start with making registration easier, and you have to move to making sure access to the ballot is secure, and accessible for everyone, and you have to ensure that you have electoral structures that permit a meaningful vote to be cast. The worst thing is for those youth or their parents to believe their vote doesn't count because they continually see their candidates lose as a result of at-large election systems or gerrymandering of districts to prevent minorities from having a meaningful vote.
Thank you. Reverend, did you want to speak a little bit to this idea of allowing 16-year-olds to pre-register within a community like yours in Detroit? And I mean, you have a large NAACP branch there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator, and appreciate your work. And we have a large Latino community there as well, and a large Arab community. Detroit and Dearborn has the largest composition of Arab Americans outside of the Middle East. So it is a very diverse community. Let me suggest this, and I'll answer your question, but I want to say this for the record, and I have to say this, Senator, because I wouldn't be who I am if I didn't say this. My folk expect me to say this, so I'm going to say it. That is, first of all, there was a study done by the Loyola University in which Justin Levitt found that out of 1 billion votes cast between 2000 and 2014, out of 1 billion votes cast, only 31 were cases of voter fraud, 31 out of a billion between 2000 and 2014. There would be much more weight given to a commission on integrity if the same commission was concerned about Russian interference with the electoral process of the nation. Yet the same president and the same composition of the commission is disavowing any connection to that at all. Yet the intelligence agencies of the nation have said that there was interference with our election. So that right there delegitimizes anything they would bring to the table. So when you ask the question of whether or not young people at 16 should be engaged, no question about it. When young people graduate from high school, they should be given a diploma and a temporary voter card, registration card. They can't vote then, but they should be given a diploma and a card that says, I'm getting ready to vote, with some tenets of why it's important to vote on it. That should be across America. Every school, public, private, doesn't matter. All of us should have that. In addition to the fact that we in Detroit have what we call the ABCs of voting. Voter registration, voter mobilization, voter participation, and voter protection. Because it has to be a holistic approach, as Cheryl and others have said. The Attorney General of the United States of America is almost gleeful when it comes to pulling back on voter registration and protection and enforcement. It's almost like he's having, I won't say it, but it's almost like he's overjoyful, he's gleeful at pulling back. Many of us in the African American community view this time as another Reconstruction, to the degree that if you understand the history of America, and I know you do, in the 1876 election of Tilden and Hayes, there was a compromise made of 1877 in which one individual would get the election presidency if, in fact, certain things were done down south, meaning to pull back the advancements that African Americans had made. It was a dilution of their power. It was a taking away of all the advancements that they had made. And it also indicated that the North would not enforce any of the laws, any of the codes, any of the situations that would protect the rights of African Americans. Well, we've just experienced 8 years of Barack Obama. There is a backlash. Let's just be honest. There is a backlash to everything that has been done relative to this. Our nation is becoming more black and brown. Whether we like it or not, that's the way of the world. It doesn't make us anything other than the way that's going to go. That intimidates people. That intimidates the president and the attorney general relative to the emphasis that they have. So in line with that, as you can see, the power to pull back, and it has to be holistic, it's all connected. Pull back voter registration. Pull back the emphasis of voter enforcement. Pull back the DOJ's emphasis relative to Texas and North Carolina. Pull back enforcing the consent decrees in police departments in minority communities. Pull back the militarization of police departments relative to how they engage the community. Pull back. That's the same thing that was done in 1877. Pull back. So in 2017, we're now seeing a pullback. And so you cannot separate what has occurred from what is occurring. And it all has a definite effect to the degree that is designed to intimidate, to frustrate, and to eliminate the vote. When you beat the people down so much and you make it so difficult for them to access the polls, who wants to go? Who wants to stand in line? Who wants to go to a poll and they've been changed and nobody notified them? Mm-hmm. How many seniors want to drive and use money that they use for pharmaceutical products and food to have to pay for state-issued IDs when their driver's license or social security card, and they've been voting in the same place for 20, 30, and 40, and 50 years? Mm-hmm. That is an affront to all of us as Americans. That's not a black thing, a brown thing, a white thing, a yellow thing. That's the right thing. The right thing is for us to engage in a process that brings everybody to the table, beginning when our young people are in school. When they walk across that stage, two things: your diploma and your voter registration or temporary voter participation card. That means you all in now. Everybody, and that's not a partisan issue, that's an American issue. And so I think that we can resolve this, but it has to be holistic. If we improve the voting process and we still got these other issues, Senator, we still got a problem. If we resolve those other issues and we can't vote, you know we got a problem. So I'm simply saying it's going to require all of us to be committed. I like what Senator Warren said when she said oversight, because these folk are working out of sight to make sure that they can take back what they think they have lost. When I hear "Let's make America great again," I don't know what period in American history they're talking about and who they're talking about. To the degree that, are you talking about the antebellum period? Are you talking about Reconstruction period? Are you talking about the 1930s and 40s or 50s when none of us were on TV? What part of Make America Great are you talking about? So I'm simply saying, if we really want to make America great, let's make America fair and just.
I don't think I can top that. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator, and thank you very much, Reverend Anthony, for giving us a wonderful close to a very important hearing. I want to just note for the record, we had 16 members of our caucus that joined us today, Democratic senators, many of whom have introduced legislation like Senator Duckworth, and most of us who have signed on to co-sponsor those efforts, because this is foundational to our democracy and freedom in our country. Whether voting is suppressed by the efforts of a foreign country or by governments in our own country, either way, it's got to stop. And so I'm hopeful that by taking this opportunity and having this discussion, that our Senate Republican colleagues in the majority chairing the committees will be willing to join with us in formal hearings on legislation that will actually create more opportunities for people to vote, more integrity and vote, more resources for training, for equipment, for those things that will allow us to be able to fully say to everyone as an American citizen that you have the right to vote and that we mean it. So thank you very much.